It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. President Trump issued an executive order on Friday renewing sanctions against Venezuela. As required by law, the executive order states that Venezuela continues to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. The sanctions renewal comes a day after the Venezuelan government announced it reached an agreement with all presidential candidates to postpone the presidential elections from April 22nd to May 20th. Despite this agreement, most opposition parties continue to call for a boycott. They say that not enough of their demands have been met, such as the appointment of a new National Electoral Council. Joining me now to discuss the Trump administration's effort to stop the presidential elections in Venezuela is Mark Weisbrot. Mark is the co-director of the Center for Economic Policy and Research and is the author of Failed: What Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thanks for having me, Sharmini.
Mark, the Trump administration says sanctions are because Venezuela poses a threat to the U.S. That threat is described how by the United States?
Well, you read it in the statement. It's described as unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. They don't really try to make that case. That is, as you said, that's required by law to issue such an executive order for sanctions. And there's a reason that's in the law. It's because you're not supposed to do that just because you don't like a government. And under international law, of course, the sanctions are violating international law. The OAS Charter, for example, the Hague Conventions that the U.S. is signatory to also are violated by that. So in other words, the language is there because you are really not supposed to do it unless there really is some kind of national, really severe national security threat to your own country. And of course, there's nobody can really make that case.
All right, Mark, so with the absence of the threat, the other main reason for the sanctions apparently is that they believe, that means the U.S. believe, that the presidential election and the vote will be illegitimate. Is there any reason to believe that the elections will be illegitimate or fraudulent?
Well, first of all, I don't really know what they believe, but I think they want us to believe that the elections are illegitimate because they've been trying to overthrow the government. And of course, that's been true of the Bush and Obama administrations as well. But the Trump administration is different in they openly admit it. And you had, Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, is the one who's really deciding policy for the Trump administration, according to people very high up in that administration. And so he said openly that the military should overthrow the government. The Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, also said when he was in South America just recently, he basically said the same thing. So they're not even trying to hide it. And then, of course, they've imposed these financial sanctions on the country, which make it impossible for the economy to recover while those sanctions are in effect. Not completely impossible, but almost impossible, because it prevents them from borrowing or from restructuring their debt, which are both conditions they would need to have an economic recovery. So it's really an attempt. So they don't want anybody to believe these elections are real. But the problem they're running into is that there is a credible opposition candidate, a former governor and retired military officer, Henry Falcon, who is running. And he's reached an agreement. And it's not just him. He's got a couple of parties backing him. And he's also polling the best of any opposition or really any candidate. In fact, the latest, most reliable polls show that he would probably beat Maduro, they say by a margin of 7 or 8 percentage points. So it's a credible candidate. and yet they don't want this to happen. The Trump administration doesn't want this to happen, and they have allies in the kind of extreme opposition who also are going along with it so far.
Mark, you mentioned Henry Falcon. Now, you published an article in U.S. News and World Report in which you had some pretty explosive information. You state that Trump administration is threatening the main candidate opposing President Maduro, and that is Henry Falcon. So tell us what these threats consist of and a little bit more about Henry Falcon's background.
Well, Falcon was told by U.S. officials that if he entered the race for president, he could be threatened. He could be the recipient of financial sanctions against him personally. And he entered the race anyway. And he's a former governor and retired military officer. He was in the government or with the government until 2010, and then for the last 8 years he's been in the opposition, and he's more moderate than some of the other opposition leaders who are boycotting the election.
And Mark, how did you come across this information that Falcon was being threatened by the United States?
Well, that was from a source who had knowledge of the conversation, and I can't really say who that was, because they wouldn't put their name on it.
Right.
But it's there isn't any doubt about it, and it should be. There are other reporters from major news outlets that are also looking into it now, and will probably report it, I assume.
Mark, why is the Trump administration so intent on preventing a presidential election that the opposition has been demanding and calling for a couple of years now?
Well, I think the Trump strategy is regime change. They want to overthrow the government. Their strategy has been to try and make the economy worse, and through the financial sanctions especially, so that people will get into the streets and topple the government. Now, why wouldn't they want to have this kind of an election? I think you'd have to ask them that. But if I were to guess, I would say they want their people in there. They want somebody who owes their allegiance to them. And they want a government, if you look at one of the differences between Falcon and the rest of the opposition is he's less likely to endorse a kind of violent retribution and political persecution of the government and their supporters than the other opposition leaders that the Trump administration is close to. I think that's one major difference, is whether there's going to be a negotiated solution that protects all sides. You have a third of the electorate, about 6 million people who support the government, and you have many people, of course, have been part of the government. And so you have to have some kind of guarantees, and I think they don't want that.
And finally, Mark, what comparisons can you make in terms of these elections that are about to take place in Venezuela and the ones that took place in Honduras not too long ago?
Well, there's no real comparison. I mean, the Honduran elections, nobody really believes that those were honest. I mean, they were quite obviously stolen, as you know, and from all the reports that you've had on it. And in Venezuela, you've had elections now under this political party in power, under Chavez first and under Maduro. And, there really has never been any doubt about the vote count in any of the contested election. There was one uncontested election for the Constituent Assembly where there were some doubts raised, and you don't really know for sure what the vote count was because there weren't opposition participation and opposition observers. But all the contested elections, the vote count was never in doubt, with the exception of one governor's race recently out of 23, where there was probably some kind of cheating done at the local level. But really, you've had a very, very secure vote count for just about all of the last 20 years. And So that's completely different from Honduras. It's completely different from Mexico. There's a lot of countries where, in South America, there's all kinds of vote buying and ballot stuffing that really goes far beyond anything that you've seen in Venezuela.
All right, Mark, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.